Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the latest revelations surrounding General Hospital are weaving together one of the darkest and most emotionally charged storylines in recent memory, all centering on the long-buried truth of a car accident that nearly shattered the lives of several key characters. The chain of events begins when Molly Lansing Davis stumbles across disturbing information that Cody Bell has been carrying. In a moment that changes everything, Cody discloses to Molly that Kristina Corinthos Davis once hired him to seduce Ava Jerome. For Molly, this revelation makes little sense. The motives are murky, the logic is thin, and nothing about Kristina's actions aligns with what she thought she knew about her sister. Cody attempts to justify it by insisting that Kristina was only trying to keep Rick Lansing away from Ava, claiming her intentions were protective. But to Molly, the reasoning feels shallow, contrived, and more like a cover story than the full truth. It sparks the realization that there are larger, darker forces at play, forces her sister has been hiding from everyone. From this moment, Molly begins scrutinizing Kristina more closely than ever before. Every word, every look, every unexplained absence starts to feel suspicious. The longer she observes, the more convinced she becomes that Kristina has been shouldering a secret far heavier than anyone imagined. While Molly follows her instincts, Kristina finds herself embroiled in yet another explosive confrontation with Rick Lansing. Old wounds resurface as the two clash bitterly over blackmail schemes and unresolved tensions from the past, including whispers of the car accident that continues to cast a shadow over them. Their father-daughter relationship, already fragile, begins to spiral into dangerous territory, with both Rick and Kristina pushing one another toward breaking points. This escalation creates the perfect storm for Molly to act. Seeing Kristina unravel and recognizing that the walls are closing in, Molly seizes the opportunity to corner her sister. She presses Kristina relentlessly, her questions sharp, direct, and unflinching. Kristina resists at first, clinging to denial as though it is her last defense. Yet Molly's persistence, combined with the mounting tension from Rick's accusations, traps Kristina in a vice she cannot escape. Her bravado crumbles, leaving her raw and exposed. In a moment of emotional collapse, Kristina finally begins to speak the words she has buried for far too long. Her confession shocks Molly to her core. Kristina admits that everything stemmed from her obsessive need to wedge herself between Rick and Ava, a partnership that carried both romantic and criminal weight. Ava and Rick, bound together through schemes of extortion and manipulation, were becoming a dangerous force. Kristina feared losing all control, so she inserted herself into their lives with reckless determination. She reveals that she not only schemed to manipulate Rick's affections but also became directly entangled in the extortion plot itself. The admission exposes a pattern of deception, desperation, and a willingness to cross lines that Molly never believed her sister would approach. But the confession does not stop there. Kristina's voice, trembling yet unrelenting, unveils the most horrifying piece of all. She recounts the night she attempted to sabotage Ava by targeting what she thought was Ava's car. Acting in anger and blinded by her desire to gain the upper hand, Kristina tampered with the vehicle, only to discover too late that it belonged to Rick. The near-fatal consequences of her actions left Rick and Elizabeth Baldwin on the brink of disaster, and the weight of that mistake has haunted Kristina ever since. For Molly, the revelation is like a knife to the chest. Her sister, the person she had been striving to rebuild trust with, is the very reason their family almost unraveled. The shock is overwhelming. Molly reels at the betrayal, the lies, and the realization that Kristina's protective choices were in fact dangerous manipulations that nearly cost lives. Their bond, once fragile but mending, begins to fracture all over again. Molly cannot reconcile the sister she loves with the woman who orchestrated such chaos. The guilt radiating from Kristina only deepens the devastation, as it becomes clear that Kristina has been silently carrying the burden while allowing others to shoulder the blame. This revelation also sets in motion a ripple effect that threatens to engulf the entire Corinthos Davis family. Rick, once targeted, may not forgive such a transgression. Alexis, whose role as mother has always been to hold the family together, faces the devastating reality that her daughter's reckless choices have not only endangered lives but also jeopardized the fragile unity she has tried so hard to preserve. And Cody, who casually revealed the truth about Kristina's manipulation, now becomes an unpredictable wild card, holding secrets that could further shatter already fragile alliances. What unfolds is more than just a family dispute, it is a reckoning. Kristina's desperate need for control, Molly's fierce pursuit of the truth, Rick's battle for redemption, and Alexis's struggle to protect her family are all colliding in a storyline that feels less like coincidence and more like destiny. Each character is being forced to confront the consequences of deception, betrayal, and the toxic legacy of secrets left to fester. The car accident, once considered an unfortunate tragedy, is exposed as the product of calculated sabotage, leaving viewers to wonder how far Kristina will go to protect what remains of her life and whether Molly has the strength to expose her own sister to the harsh light of justice. The unraveling of this secret transforms the entire dynamic of the Corinthos Davis family. The fragile balance between loyalty and betrayal teeters on collapse, while every character is left questioning how much truth they can bear. And as the fallout spreads, the question grows louder with each passing moment: is there any way back from a betrayal this deep, or has Kristina finally destroyed the very bond she sought so desperately to control? Kristina's confession was more than just words spilling out in desperation, it was a tidal wave crashing through the fragile foundation of her family, threatening to drown everyone in its path. She admitted that in a storm of anger, jealousy, and fear, she had tampered with a car, fully believing it belonged to Ava Jerome. Her intention had not been noble, it had been an act of impulsive control, a way of lashing out at a woman she believed held dangerous sway over Rick. But fate had been merciless. The car was Rick's, and Elizabeth Baldwin had been with him. The realization that she had nearly ended both of their lives haunted Kristina in every waking moment. It was the kind of mistake that could never be undone, the kind of crime that lived in shadows, suffocating the person who committed it until the truth could no longer be contained. For Kristina, keeping the secret had been a daily act of survival. She carried it like a burning coal in her chest, pretending to be fine while hiding the reality that she was the author of a tragedy narrowly averted. Every time Rick walked into a room, every time Elizabeth's name was mentioned, every time Alexis looked at her with trust and love, Kristina's stomach twisted with shame. The guilt eroded her from the inside, but the fear of losing everything, her father's respect, her mother's love, her family's fragile unity, had been stronger than her desire to come clean. Until Molly cornered her. Until the walls closed in and silence was no longer an option. Molly's reaction was visceral. The words seemed to echo endlessly in her head as if her brain refused to process them in real time. Her sister, the one she had defended countless times, the one she had cried with, argued with, and reconciled with, Kristina, had nearly killed Rick. The betrayal was personal on a level Molly couldn't articulate. They had worked so hard to rebuild the trust that had been fractured between them over the years, and now, in an instant, it was shattered again. Molly's pain was not only in the act itself but in the months of lies that followed, the false smiles and hollow reassurances that concealed the monstrous truth. Her heart waged war with her mind. Molly wanted to scream at Kristina, to demand why she had thought violence could ever be the answer, to make her understand the magnitude of what she had done. But beneath the fury was a deep sorrow, an aching grief that the sister she loved was also the person who had endangered their father's life. Worse still, Molly knew the consequences of such a revelation. If she exposed Kristina, the fallout would be catastrophic. Rick would never forgive her. Elizabeth would demand justice. Alexis, their mother, would be broken, forced to choose between the law and her daughter. And Kristina, already crumbling under the weight of her actions, could face not just alienation but prison. The dilemma was paralyzing. Protect her sister and carry this poisonous secret forever, or tell the truth and destroy everything. Molly's instincts pulled her in both directions. She wanted to shield Kristina, to prevent her life from unraveling completely, but she also felt the moral obligation to Rick and Elizabeth, who had suffered because of Kristina's recklessness. The longer she sat with the knowledge, the more suffocating it became. Silence felt like complicity, and yet exposure felt like betrayal. Christina, meanwhile, was trapped in her own private nightmare. She knew that once Molly knew, the secret no longer belonged to her alone. Any moment, Molly could decide to tell Rick or Alexis, and Christina's world would collapse. The fear gnawed at her, making every interaction with her family feel like a ticking time bomb. She could no longer look Rick in the eyes without hearing the screech of tires in her memory. She could no longer listen to Alexis's words of encouragement without feeling like a fraud. Christina's desire to protect her mother was at the core of her actions, but the cruel irony was that the truth, once revealed, would devastate Alexis most of all. And then there was Cody Bell, the unpredictable piece in this dangerous puzzle. Cody had already revealed too much, exposing Christina's manipulation when she hired him to seduce Ava. But Cody was not a man bound by loyalty, his decisions were often guided by opportunity. Now that he knew how deep Christina's lies ran, he held leverage that could be used at any time. A single careless remark, a calculated reveal, or a betrayal made for personal gain could topple everything Christina had fought to keep hidden. He was a loose cannon, one that both sisters knew could detonate at any moment. Beyond the immediate circle, the ripples of Christina's confession threatened to extend further. Elizabeth, who had no idea she had narrowly escaped death, would be horrified to learn the truth. Her already complicated history with Rick would be stained with new layers of mistrust and fear. If Rick learned that his daughter had nearly killed him, his response would be explosive. Known for his volatility and inability to forgive betrayal, Rick would likely sever ties with Christina forever, exiling her not only from his life but also from any semblance of trust. Alexis, however, was the most heartbreaking figure in this equation. A mother who had spent her life defending her children, fighting for their futures despite her own flaws, would be faced with a decision no parent should ever have to make. Protect her daughter at the cost of justice, or uphold the law and watch her family unravel. Christina's desire to protect Alexis had been the twisted justification for her actions, but in the end, it could be Alexis who suffered the most. The Corinthos Davis family was perched on the edge of a precipice, and Christina's secret was the gust of wind that could send them plummeting into chaos. Every choice moving forward carried devastating consequences. Molly's silence would eat her alive, Christina's guilt would continue to corrode her spirit, and the looming threat of exposure could tear the family apart at any moment. The truth was no longer something that could be buried, it had a pulse, a life of its own, and it demanded to be heard. What began as a single reckless act, pressing the brakes of the wrong car, had spiraled into a story of betrayal, guilt, and impossible choices. Christina was left clinging to the hope that her family could forgive her if the truth emerged, while Molly was burdened with the question of whether forgiveness was even possible. The story had transformed from a hidden accident into a reckoning for everyone involved, forcing them to confront not only what had happened but who they truly were when faced with unbearable truths. The tragedy of it all was that no matter which path Molly chose, the damage had already been done. Trust was broken. Love was tainted by betrayal. And the shadow of that night, when Christina's impulsive act nearly destroyed their family, would haunt them for years to come. The fragile foundation of the Corinthos Davis family was now splintering under the immense pressure of truth, betrayal, and unspoken resentments that had been festering for years. What had begun as the resurfacing of a nearly forgotten car accident had transformed into a wildfire of revelations, each one tearing through the already fragile bonds of trust that connected them. The family, once held together by Alexis's unwavering determination to protect her children and Rick's reluctant but undeniable pull toward reconciliation, now stood on the verge of a complete collapse. Molly's anguish grew heavier with every passing day. The knowledge she carried was unbearable, a toxic weight pressing down on her conscience and poisoning her interactions with the very people she loved most. When she looked at Rick, all she could see was the narrow escape he had made from death because of Christina's reckless hands. When she looked at Alexis, she saw a mother who seemed ready to shield Christina at any cost, blind to the reality that Molly herself had become the silent victim of this entire ordeal. In Molly's eyes, she was the one suffering most. Not because she had caused the pain, but because she alone was burdened with the impossible choice between exposing her sister or protecting her. Every conversation with Rick seemed to chip away at her already shaken trust. He carried himself with the same stern composure as always, but Molly couldn't ignore the thought that perhaps he had known more than he let on, or that he had willfully ignored the signs. Rick had always been a man with sharp instincts. How had he failed to notice the storm brewing in Kristina? How had he allowed the family to drift toward ruin? Molly's respect for him eroded, replaced by doubt, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. She had always longed for his approval, always wanted to believe that beneath his flaws he was still the father who could guide her, but now she found herself recoiling from him, unsure if he had failed them through weakness, arrogance, or indifference. Her disappointment in Alexis was even sharper. Alexis had always prided herself on being the glue, the protector, the fierce mother who stood between her daughters and the world. But now, Molly felt like that fierce love had been unevenly distributed. Alexis, in her desperation to hold Kristina together, seemed willing to sacrifice Molly's trust in the process. Every time Alexis rushed to soften Kristina's guilt or brushed aside the severity of her actions, Molly felt invisible, as though her pain did not matter. The bond between mother and daughter began to fray, with Molly silently accusing Alexis of failing her in the one way that mattered most, choosing fairness over favoritism. Meanwhile, Kristina's confession had not brought her relief, it had instead deepened her torment. She thought that admitting the truth to Molly might lift the crushing weight of her secret, but it had only spread the poison further. Now, every glance from Molly was filled with disappointment, every silence heavy with unspoken judgment. Kristina was haunted by the reality that her actions had not only nearly killed Rick and Elizabeth, but had also fractured her bond with Molly beyond repair. She lived in constant fear, her paranoia growing with each passing moment. Every knock on the door, every unexpected phone call, every sharp tone from Rick or Alexis sent her spiraling into panic. She knew the truth could surface at any moment, and the thought of facing her father's wrath, Elizabeth's condemnation, and Alexis's shattered trust left her trembling. Rick himself was caught in an invisible web, unaware of the storm gathering around him. He continued to navigate his uneasy position within the family, clashing with Kristina, sparring with Alexis, and attempting to maintain his authority. But the truth was a silent predator circling closer each day. When Rick eventually discovered that his own daughter had nearly cost him his life, the explosion would be devastating. Rick's pride, his sense of control, his very identity as a father would be obliterated. Those who knew him understood that forgiveness did not come easily to Rick Lansing, if it came at all. Elizabeth, too, stood unknowingly on the edge of heartbreak. She had survived the accident without ever realizing how deliberate the danger had been. If she learned the truth, that Kristina had targeted what she believed to be Ava's car but had instead endangered her and Rick, the betrayal would cut deep. For Elizabeth, who had already endured years of trauma and loss, this revelation would be one more wound carved by the people she trusted. And then there was Alexis. Her role as mother was both her shield and her curse. She wanted desperately to believe in the goodness of her children, to protect them from the consequences of their worst mistakes. But Kristina's confession would place her in an impossible position. Continue protecting Kristina, even if it meant destroying her bond with Molly and alienating Rick, or finally accept that sometimes love required accountability. Alexis's heart would be torn between two daughters, one guilty and one betrayed, and no matter her choice, she would lose. Looming in the background, Cody Bell remained the wild card no one could predict. He knew too much about Kristina's schemes, her manipulations, and her willingness to go to dangerous extremes. Cody had no loyalty to the Corinthos Davis family, and his silence could not be trusted. At any moment, he could decide to expose what he knew, whether for leverage, for money, or out of spite. His presence in the story ensured that Kristina's secret was never truly safe, and Molly knew this all too well. The accident, once dismissed as a tragic mistake, had become the epicenter of a new storm. It was no longer about broken brakes and screeching tires. It was about betrayal, guilt, survival, and the shattering of family bonds. Each member of the Corinthos Davis family was caught in the pull of its gravity, unable to escape the consequences of choices made long ago. Christina was forced to stare into the darkest corners of her own soul, wondering if she was still worthy of love or redemption. Molly wrestled with her conscience, struggling to decide whether silence was a betrayal or whether truth was the only path to justice. Rick stood on the precipice of devastation, his world set to collapse once the truth reached him. Alexis faced the ultimate test of motherhood, caught between protecting her daughter and facing the truth. And Cody lurked in the shadows, a ticking time bomb who could detonate the entire family's fragile peace at any moment. The storm was inevitable.